Next, we come to Great Zimbabwe. And this is another broad statement about the distribution of African art. We can't focus solely on Western Africa along the Gulf of Guinea or Eastern Africa. We need to look at Africa as a whole. And here we're in Southern Africa looking at another great cultural group. Now, Great Zimbabwe itself is a complex of ruins at a political center. And what we see is walls and towers predominantly featuring in the landscape. This probably indicates warfare because one does not generally defend themselves if one has nothing to defend themselves from. This is no different than what we've seen, for example, in the ancient Near East, or we've seen in Europe in the medieval, or Europe in the Bronze Age, really. And this was a center of trade with China and Europe. And you're saying, wait, Zimbabwe was a center of trade? That doesn't make any sense, but actually it is. So Greater Zimbabwe is along these ancient spice routes. We always think of spices coming along the Silk Road and then the Portuguese finding, I'm doing air quotes, you can't see that here, but finding the spices and bringing them back to Europe. But those trade routes were run by Arab and African traders for at least a millennia before that, if not longer. Many of those spices prior to the Portuguese involvement were actually coming up through Africa. And oftentimes they would take routes as far south as Greater Zimbabwe down here and then travel further up the coast or sometimes over inland routes. So many of the traders from Venice and elsewhere would actually get their spices in North Africa, crossing the Mediterranean much easier than going all the way out here. The reason this all falls apart will be the Portuguese. And it's because they arm their ships, whereas all these trading vessels didn't bother arming themselves because there really weren't any conflicts along the trade routes, not between the traders. Obviously, things happen between the various states, but that's a whole nother story. So we see this as a major trade center before European coastal colonization, mostly by the Portuguese in the 15th century, the 1400s. But the piece we're actually looking at from Greater Zimbabwe is going to be the monolith with Bird and Crocodile. This piece is one of 8 similar, and here we see some of them, 8 similar monoliths. 7 were probably shrines to ancestors. Now, the people of Great Zimbabwe, just like so many other cultures that have existed throughout the world, don't write down the purpose of these pieces. So oftentimes we are left without context and we are trying to figure out what they may have been used for. The 8th here was set elsewhere, possibly as a shrine to the ruler's wife. And the piece we're looking at, we see the bird at the top, and this may symbolize the ruler's wife's ancestral roots. So where does the ruler's wife come from in terms of family lineage? Now, that's going to be important. Ancestor worship is key throughout many, many world cultures. The crocodile may actually be her male ancestors. So we're seeing a symbolism where we're looking at possibly a symbol of maternal lineage here and paternal lineage here, speaking to the female ancestors and the male ancestors separately. The circles under the bird are the eyes, quote, eyes of the crocodile, and these symbolize her female elder ancestors. Notice the 5 toes without claws. Why would you have 5 toes without claws? Well, we're basically taking these animals and anthropomorphizing them. So we have an animal that we're applying human characteristics to. It gives us that sense of humanity within the creature. The bird is likely a bird of prey. We tend to associate with birds of prey, especially in terms of power. While Ben Franklin did in fact push the idea of a turkey as the national bird, it would have never happened. We've never seen turkeys take down an animal, whereas we chose the bald eagle, a creature that sounds really odd if you ever hear it call, and scavenges fish. But anyway, getting away from that, it is a raptor, and it is a creature that we tend to associate with power. The bird and the crocodile may be messengers between the living and the dead. We see similar ideas in many cultures. The Egyptians, for example, see animals as messengers. And this may be particularly important. Now imagine that this is a piece referring to ancestor worship. Someone might come to it and pray to these animals with the understanding that the animals will go ahead and speak to the gods on their behalf or speak to the ancestors on their behalf. This is actually very similar to what we see in the West, where one might pray to a saint, and that saint is expected to intercede on your behalf to God or whomever else. The difference is, instead of people, these are animals. The concept is really the same.